Nikos, I would like you to introduce Gloria Ronson. Gloria Ronson is the teacher who I told you she's working with English as lingua franca and globalization and everything. This is Gloria. You could
Gloria.
just.
Hello, Professor. Thank you, Adriana, very much. And I want to say, Professor Nikos, that it's a great pleasure for our university here in Mexico to have you have this talk. And I have read so much about you and heard you in some other um, meetings with the Brazilian Academy. And I just want to invite all my colleagues from the State University of Veracruz to pay a lot of attention to you, to what you are going to share with us today, because I'm sure it will broaden our perspective of the implication of teaching English in this globalized and highly intercultural world. But what you propose as being aware as a language teacher is so important.
Okay, yeah, because
So much.
Yes, Nikos.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Gloria. It's my pleasure and honor to connect with you and everybody. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, I would like to introduce her because she was very interested and excited that you would be with us today. Thank you, Gloria. Okay, I think it's time. We could start, I think. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar English as a Lingua Franca and the EFL Classroom, from start to finish. I would like to give a warm welcome to teachers from the 6 language centers of the 5 regions of the Universidad Veracruzana, teachers of the 11 self-access centers, and teachers from the language school in Jalapa. Thank you for being with us today. The seminar will address the role of English as a lingua franca in today's world and how and why it can be integrated in the EFL classroom. We will first describe ELF and give examples of ELF discourse, as well as look at ingredients and characteristics of effective ELF interactions. We will then consider the need to incorporate the principles and concerns of ELF in EFL teaching and look at the difficulties and challenges of doing so. The framework we will be presenting is that of ELF awareness. Finally, we will put the ELF awareness perspective into practice. We will present a series of examples of typical, authentic EFL textbook activities and consider ways of rendering them ELF aware by adding metalinguistic and metacognitive questions and tasks. The seminar will incorporate frequent questions addressed to the audience that will hopefully lead to an interesting dialogue in the question and answer session at the end. I would like to ask all the participants to maintain your mix off for the first part, and then you can turn it on if you want to ask a question in the question and answer session at the end. Now, it is my real pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Nikos Ifakis. Professor Nikos Ifakis is a full professor of English for specific purposes in the Department of English Language and Literature of the National University of Athens. He's also director of the Masters in Education in TESOL program of the Hellenic Open University and has been involved in it since its inception in 1998. He holds a PhD in Language and Linguistics from the University of Essex. He's founding editor-in-chief of research papers in language teaching and learning. He has published more than 70 research papers, which appear in various international refereed journals, among others, Applied Linguistics, TESOL Quarterly, ELT Journal, English for Specific Purposes, International Journal of Applied Linguistics, Language and Education, Systems, edited collections, and conference proceedings. He also acts as a regular external referee for the above journals. His research interests include intercultural communication and pedagogy, teaching and researching English as an international lingua franca, language teaching methodology, distance education, adult education, and teacher education. Professor Sifakis has been a visiting professor in many universities around the world, but not in Mexico. Taught all over Europe and also in Colombia, Thailand, and Taiwan. He's co-editor of English as a lingua franca for EFL contexts, using English as a lingua franca in education in Europe and English language education policies and practices in the Mediterranean countries. Author of The English Language and Globalization, Facets of Present-Day Reality in Greece, Europe, and the Rest of the World. And guest editor of the colloquium titled ELF Awareness in ELT, bringing together theory and practice. Nikos, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. I hope it's not the first time we have the opportunity to work with you. And thanks to the magic of technology, welcome to Mexico. Welcome to Universidad Veracruzana. So, without further ado, I give you Professor Nikos Sifakis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for your very generous introduction, for your invitation. I'm really, really glad and genuinely honored to be here with you, with your group. Thanks a lot to Gloria for being here too, and for everybody. I am connecting with you from my home country and town, Athens, Greece, in Europe, where it's early evening here. It's dark outside already, the beginning of winter, but a very nice winter so far, the end of autumn. And, you know, it's the best time to talk about English as a lingua franca and see what has been done in the area of English as a lingua franca over the past few years. Because we live in a world where English is everywhere. It's a globalized situation. We use English a lot, but do we really appreciate that? Do we really show that we understand the power that we have as non-native users of the language? And the power is huge. So what we're going to do is I have, as you can see, a number of slides that I will base my seminar on. I would like you to send any questions or any comments that you have. If you are joining us from Zoom, you can use the chat in Zoom. And there's also a YouTube live streaming right now. And I think Adriana has posted the link in the chat. And you can use the comments in the YouTube streaming if you want as well. And I'll do my best to try and respond to your comments. Let's try and keep the comments at the end. We can have a questions and answer session at the end of this seminar. My aim is for you not to leave this seminar without a concrete understanding of what English as a lingua franca is, what it means for EFL teachers, and Mexico is an EFL country, and how we can incorporate English as a lingua franca in whatever way in our teaching contexts. And I would really like to hear your reactions, your ideas and perceptions and perspectives, because frankly, we are looking for the way to do that. We don't have all the answers. These are just suggestions. So this is a very exciting time for English language teaching, I think. This is the structure of my seminar. I will begin with the first part will be about English as a lingua franca, as a concept, as a notion, as a term. I'm sure you know the term English as lingua franca, or ELF, as we affectively call it. So I'll talk about that for a few minutes. Once we have the notion defined with some examples, then we will go to the interesting question of integrating ELF within the EFL classroom. It's the $50,000 question. It's a really important question. How do we do that? Do we want to do that? And if so, what are the challenges? What are the dangers and the opportunities? What do we have to gain from it? I believe quite a lot. And I'm going to present the framework that I'm kind of spearheading, which is called ELF awareness. So I'll talk about that in the second section of the seminar. And the third section will be even more exciting because I will give you specific concrete examples, real life examples from integrating ELF awareness within an EFL context. I'm going to give you an example from Greece, from a Greek EFL textbook that is used very widely in state schools today. And I will show you how the activities in EFL textbooks that are very typical traditional EFL activities. You can imagine what I mean by that, a traditional native speaker kind of standard English activities, how they can be enriched with the addition of ELF-aware questions. Is that fair? I think it's a nice idea, I think. So let's start with English as a lingua franca. What is English as a lingua franca? The term has been with us for a number of years. It's not a new term. The term lingua franca is a very old term, and it refers to using a language that is not our own in order to communicate with people with whom we don't have any other shared means of communication. So we use English. Firth was among the first researchers way before ELF was a kind of established notion in ELT. And you can see the definition that he gave as a contact language between persons who share neither a common native tongue nor a common national culture, and for whom English is the chosen foreign language of communication. So in this slide, you see the, let's say, traditional definition of English as a lingua franca. It's the language or the variety or a means of communicating linguistically, of communicating with other non-native speakers of English. Or it's any interactions involving non-native speaker of English, which means that even we can use English as a lingua franca even with native speakers of English. Whenever you have a non-native speaker of English or non-native user of English in an interaction, then you would have, you could talk about using English as a lingua franca. Seidlerhofer, who is Barbara Seidlerhofer, one of the leading scholars in ELF research, one of the founding scholars of ELF research, defined it, as you can see, as any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice, and often the only option. In other words, you don't have any other language that you share, so you would use English. And the third definition is using English as a way of communicating interculturally. So the emphasis here is on function rather than on form. So it's not what you say, it's how you use the language. And you can add further semiotic additions to the way you use English, provided your interlocutors understand what you mean. So this is one way of defining ELF. And funnily enough, this definition of ELF means that we definitely use some form of English. English is used. That's why we call it English as a lingua franca. It's mainly spoken. Now, there have been more recent definitions of the term English as a lingua franca, in which English is not necessarily the main vehicle of interaction. So imagine when you have a group of non-native speakers of English who may share many different languages, not just English. So English is not the focus here. English may not even be the main vehicle of interaction, but one of the possible options. And sometimes it may not even be used. In that case, this is a newer, more recent conceptualization of English as a lingua franca, is English as a multilingual franca. The idea that we have access to many linguistic forms, many languages, and we can use any of these possibilities. English may be one of them, but it may not be used, or it may be used to some extent. Also, Mauranen, in the same context, defines ELF as a similect, as you can see, as a variety of a language spoken by people who have a different L1, with features transferred from the first language in parallel by individual speakers rather than by a cohesive group. In other words, ELF is always changing. It's never the same. It is influenced and defined by individuals. The individual participants, the specific participants in any interaction involving English, would form their own very original, at times very creative English way of communicating. So you have these two different conceptions of ELF, one more traditional that is based on English. English is the main vehicle of interaction. And another one where English is not even the main vehicle. You can have any other language, including English. English doesn't have the prerogative of being the only language to be used. This is important because today, I'm sure you've heard of terms like translanguaging. It's exactly that idea, the idea that we switch and change from linguistic system to linguistic system without feeling obliged to use English as the main vehicle of interaction. We can use other vehicles. You can use Spanish if you know a bit of Spanish, and Spanish would be the main vehicle with a bit of English. So it's not, nobody is measuring how important English is. It depends on the context. You see what I mean? It's entirely fluid. Now, so that's the definition of English as a lingua franca. Now, what does it look like? What does ELF look like? Well, for the past 20 years, there's been a lot of research of discourse, the ELF discourse. And this is from the voice corpus that Barbara Zeilhofer in Vienna developed with her colleagues. And you can see examples, typical examples of idiosyncratic usages of English that would be considered erroneous. But nevertheless, they have a function in ELF discourse, and they form, to some extent, ELF. So these are typical examples. For example, the question tags that are invariant. You're very busy today, isn't it? Instead of aren't you? So simplifying this, or treating who and which interchangeably. The picture who, a person which. It doesn't matter. You can use either. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because your interlocutor understands the meaning, understands what they mean, what you mean. Another example is shifting patterns of preposition use. We have to study about. About is used a lot. So prepositions, as we know, play a very central role in English. We have phrasal verbs. Prepositions is what we do. We teach prepositions, a large part of our job as EFL teachers. It's not a big deal in ELF. Another example is preference for bare or full infinitive over gerunds. I look forward to see you, not seeing you. Another example is use words that have high semantic generality, like take an operation, and you use words like take, make, get, you know, these commonly used words, instead of finding exactly, you know, the more appropriate, if you like, word for the context. And increased explicitness, how long time instead of how long. So these would be examples of ELF discourse. As you can see, the focus here is on form. And if you focus on form, if you focus on the language, syntax, and the choice of form, then of course you would have problems and you would find errors. Okay, but if you look at the function, the message still gets across, despite these so-called errors. Now, that's one way of looking at ELF, looking at what English we use. There are other ways of defining ELF, as we've seen. It's the choice that we have of using other semiotic systems in addition to English. So we can code switch between two languages if we are bilingual. We can use more than two languages in translanguaging. We can use translation. We can, when communicating, you know, who knows what we can do with English, with languages, because the important thing is to realize that when we communicate in the real world, we don't have a teacher in our head. We want to communicate. We want to get our message across. That's what's important. We are not in a formal teaching learning situation. So nobody is policing our choice, our language choices. So we can, you know, we can play games. We can be playful. We can mix words and expressions from different languages. Or we can use our L1, as you can see, quite a lot. Also, we use a lot of accommodation strategies. Using accommodation strategies is what ELF users do mainly. Because when we interact, as we do now, we get feedback from how we express our messages, and we process this into changing the way we communicate, paraphrasing, rephrasing, translating, translanguaging, code switching. All these very, very important accommodation strategies. Okay. So, obviously, what is important in ELF, and I think we understand this because we are all ELF users. We use ELF because we are not native speakers of English, so we use ELF. What's important is function, communicating, getting the message across, being communicatively efficient, making sure you are understood by your interlocutors, and tailoring your messages, the way you express, you formulate your discourse, tailoring to the communicative demands and needs of your interlocutor. That's really, really important. And this is typically not something that native speakers of English would do. But the non-native speaker does this quite extensively. So the importance is function rather than form. And that's why we make errors in many inverted commas. Another thing we need to remember is that since we focus on function, every single interaction with other non-native users is different. There's not a single interaction with other non-native speakers of English that would be that would lend itself to a system. Okay, we change. ELF interactions are fluid and hybrid, we use many, precisely because we use accommodation strategies. It's not what you say, it's how well you can formulate your message to be understood by your interlocutors. And because non-native speakers of English differ quite widely in their proficiency and competence in the language, in English, you would tend to have huge fluidity here. ELF speakers are very different, and ELF speakers are millions and millions and millions. So it's not easy to exhaustively study ELF interactions and come up with a rule-based kind of system of describing ELF as a singular linguistic system. It's not like that. And that's the problem with EFL, as we will see a little later. EFL is a system. ELF is not a system. I hope this is clear. So the important, of course, is intelligibility and comprehensibility. Now, just a note about CLIL. I don't know how important CLIL is in Mexico. CLIL is teaching English while teaching any other subject. So you can teach geography, let's say in schools, geography as a school subject in English. And this happens quite extensively in some parts of Europe and Asia, like Korea, Taiwan, and Europe, Italy, and some Scandinavian countries, Spain, and so on. They have this system of exposing school pupils, school students, to the content of a subject, not in their mother tongue, but in English, is very common. It's becoming more and more common. I don't know how big this is in Mexico. Please let me know if you want to talk about this a bit more, but it's becoming something that is more and more and more relevant in EFL teaching. So you get the geography teacher or the history teacher teaching history, or the physics teacher or the mathematics teacher teaching the subject in English. And of course, it's not going to be native speaker English. It's going to be ELF with a lot of Spanish or Finnish or Taiwanese or Chinese, okay? There's a lot of code switching and translanguaging. That's why CLIL is interesting. It focuses on content, language comes second. In the same way, ELF focuses on function, on content, on function, on what you want to say, not being correct all the time. So if your students don't understand a concept, you would translate it into their language, their native language, if you know their language. So CLIL and ELF have many links that we can think about, and there's a lot of research, increasing research in linking the two, that is really, really interesting. So it's important to understand how ELF is used in everyday interactions, because if we understand the huge relevance, the huge importance of ELF in everyday life, we will tend to realize that there's a gap between what our learners do in real life when they finish school, when they finish your lesson, their lesson, EFL lesson, and go and play games online, or go chat online, or watch YouTube videos. They would use English quite extensively, but not, it's their English. It's ELF. Understanding that, the fact that our learners have a relationship with the language is really important, because then we would see how relevant our teaching is to their real needs. EFL tends to be typically impacted by a testing culture. And if you look at course books, this becomes more and more evident. We will see examples of that. The fact that there are many comprehension checking questions and activities that are norm related, norm based. So it's important to realize exactly how our learners use English in their real lives. So it's really important, therefore, to ask yourselves these questions. First of all, how relevant is ELF for your own teaching context? With regard to your own learners, how well do you know your learners in terms of their ELF nature? How extensively do you believe they use English outside of your classes? So how relevant is ELF for your own teaching context? It's really important. I'd like you to tell me in the chat if you believe it's relevant. The second question is, to what extent would it be useful to incorporate ELF in your teaching? Would you consider incorporating it since you believe it's relevant? If you believe it's relevant, it's English language teaching, it's English language using, why wouldn't it be relevant in your own context? And since ELF focuses on function, what are the advantages of focusing on function over focusing on form when teaching any language? Why is it so necessary to focus on form, even if you know that your learners are still going to deviate from the form when they use English? So why would you focus so much on native speaker form? What would be the possible disadvantages? I look forward to reading your reflections on this. It's one first step towards becoming more aware of the reality in ELF, in using ELF, and the possibilities of using ELF in your EFL context. Okay. So what issues are raised by ELF? What are the issues that are raised? What are the concerns? And why is ELF, it's an opportunity for thinking outside the box when we think of English language teaching? Well, first of all, because it challenges the importance and status of standard English. We know that standard English as a notion doesn't exist. It exists only in the dictionaries. Who uses standard English? Even native speakers deviate from standard English. We know the terms like idiolect. We as you, even as a native speaker of Spanish, do you always use standard Spanish? Of course you don't. It depends. It always depends. So even with native speakers, there's fluidity, there's change. It depends on the context. So that's the first question. ELF challenges the status of standard English. The second question that ELF raises is a question of ownership. Who is the owner? Who controls? Who judges correctness? Who is the owner of English? Is it the native speakers? Which native speakers? Which particular ones? Because, as we've said, even native speakers deviate. So which native speakers? In the same way, there's no single native speaker who would be the ideal, if you like, the ideal target of perfect usage of English. So who owns the language? Is it an understanding of native speaker that is very difficult to define? Or is it a conceptualization of the non-native speaker of English, the non-native user of English, who let's not forget, is in the vast majority of users of English worldwide. We're talking about more than, well, nearly 2 billion speakers, users of English today around the world. 2 billion of any level, any proficiency. If you add China and India, we're talking about billion. The native speakers are, I don't know, perhaps 500-600 million. It's a minority. So who owns English? Really, who owns English? The third question to ask has to do with the importance of attitudes. Attitudes is the question of attitude has been rather downgraded in English language teaching, because we consider as teachers that the attitudes of our learners towards English don't really matter. What matters is us exposing them to proper standard English, and their job is to learn standard English. But what about their attitudes or deeper convictions? Are they really aware of the fact that they indeed are themselves ELF users? Are they even aware of that? So it's all a question of attitude. And of course, we have to realize that for the past many years, at least 2 or 3 decades or even more, English is a huge part of our lives. English is everywhere, and these are some major international domains of English. And it's these domains that have prompted the development of the notion of English as an international language, English as a global language, world Englishes, global Englishes, English as a lingua franca. All of these terms developed as a result of these domains. And these are very specific domains of using English, not necessarily as a standard language. I'm not going to go through the entire list. I'm sure you can see it. Let me just mention tourism as a huge domain. Also, tertiary education. Today we have many new universities being created around the world that use English only in their curricula. English universities, English medium universities around the world, in countries that have no relation to England or the United States. So you have these universities in Asia, in Europe, in Scandinavian countries, in France, even in Germany, in the Balkan countries, Bulgaria, Turkey. So English, we realize that English is important. And if you want to attract customers, in this case, students, English is the way to go. So that's one way of realizing. And of course, we've known for a number of years now that English is in a category of its own. This is MacArthur's categorization of languages, English language complex. This includes all English, all types of English, native, non-native, world Englishes, and so on, is in a category of its own. And then you have the big languages like Chinese in the billions, Hindi and Spanish. After that, the more you go further in the levels, languages are smaller in terms of the users. But level 3 languages are huge languages, which are still lingua francas. Arabic is the lingua franca of a number of countries in the Middle East. French, German is used in not just Europe, but in Africa, in ex-colonies. Level 4, smaller languages that are still lingua francas. Portuguese, as we know, is used in South America. Swedish is used as the lingua franca of Scandinavian countries, Swahili in Africa, and so on. And it's only when you go to level five, where you get the majority, more languages that are national languages, like my language, Greek. And the more you go further up the levels, the smaller the number of users and the larger number of languages. And level 7, you have tiny languages that are perhaps some of them even endangered, spoken by really tiny amounts of users. This is another way of defining, looking at the global language system after this one. I like terms like hypercentral, super extra central, higher, okay? English, it's in a category of its own. What does that mean? It's not in a category of its own because of its native speakers. It's in a category of its own because of us, because of the non-native speakers. We have to realize this. The non-native users of English have made it a hypercentral language. Then you have the supercentral languages, central languages, and the smaller peripheral languages. So English has a special role, and we've known this from Braj Kachru, who introduced this notion of concentric circles in the mid-1980s. I'm sure you've seen this this before. In the middle, you have the native speaker countries, the inner circle, UK, USA, Australia, Canada, and so on. Then you have the outer circle, the ex-colonies, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, and the expanding circle, everybody else practically. So we are in the expanding circle, the vast majority of speakers. Progressively, what's important is not so much the outer and expanding circles, which are growing. It's the idea that, well, yes, there is a small inner circle of native speakers themselves. Not all of them use standard English. What is standard English anyway? And who is the model native speaker? Who knows? But there is an inner circle of native speakers. After that, it's to do with the proficiency, how well you can communicate. And this is up to the individual speaker's strategies and experiences with the language. The idea here is that the more flexible the non-native speaker is, the more successful and efficient they will be in using English throughout all the circles. So the more open you are, the more flexible you are, the more open you are, and the more you realize the global nature of English, the more effective you will be in every single ELF interaction. This shows the distinction, the difference between looking at EFL as a teaching context, as a very specific teaching context that focuses on teaching a standard language, using it, approaching it as a foreign language. That's really interesting. It's interesting because EFL has the F in it, English as a foreign language. And I ask you, is it really a foreign language? Can we really, after everything we've said, is it realistic to continue to describe these contexts as foreign language contexts? Because if English is a foreign language, then what would we say when we learn Chinese? Chinese is a foreign language. Foreign means you don't use it outside the classroom. That's what foreign means. You only use it, you are exposed to it only in the classroom. Outside of the classroom, you don't use it. So Chinese, I don't think that we use it outside the classroom. Yes, we want to learn it. In Greece, Chinese is a foreign language. German is a foreign language. French is a foreign language. These are very big languages, really important languages, but they are foreign. They are not part of our experience outside of the EFL classroom. But English is not like that. So we have, on one way, looking at English as a foreign language, and we don't realize that English has been de-foreignized, as Henry Widdowson has famously said. We have the de-foreignization of English, so it's not a foreign language. This means that our learners have an opinion about English. They use English. On the other hand, it's exam oriented. Most of EFL looks towards a final target that would in most cases be exam oriented, and the exam would be native speaker defined in terms of a very specific definition of the norm. On the other hand, you have the ELF situation. As we've seen, ELF is an international reality. We use it, we see it internationally, and we see it as a way of linking between different cultures. And we're going to talk about this in a few minutes. So now we have a second question, a second topic for you. By the way, Adriana, I'm going to send you these slides, and you can send them to our colleagues here, and we can continue the discussion when we finish, because we are just opening the discussion here. These are some terms that have been used, and the idea is to think about them, because the world is changing. The world is changing. The problem is that EFL doesn't change. EFL needs to change. There are many reasons why it doesn't change. You can think many reasons: exams, international companies, textbooks. So why would it change? But on the other hand, it needs to change. These terms, I'd like you to think about problems and inconsistencies and the links between the terms on the left column and those in the right column. In the left column, we start from the native speaker. Okay, who is the native speaker? Is there, can we really talk about native speakers on one hand? Then going further from the native, we have the fluent speaker. So we can have speakers who are non-native, but fluent. So obviously we are fluent, okay? So fluency is one way of looking at using English. Or we can define the accurate speaker, the speaker who is very accurate, or careful. We are careful, we want to be careful. Now, this is what, in my view at least, EFL teachers tend to lean towards. EFL teachers who are not native speakers see themselves, or want to be, as much as possible, fluent speakers, accurate speakers, and careful speakers, especially in the EFL classroom, because they see themselves as the model of English for their students. Yes? So the EFL teacher, and now I'm going to the right column, essentially is the guardian or the custodian of English, of fluent English, accurate English, and careful English for their learners. The learners look up to the teachers as someone who is always fluent, accurate, and careful. They wouldn't make mistakes, because this is their job as an English teacher, okay? To expose them to accurate English and to correct their mistakes. That's what the teacher does. Now, this becomes interesting because we are slowly moving the discussion from what ELF is in reality and what English looks like in EFL. In EFL, you have, on the one hand, you have a very strong native speaker orientation. You also have the EFL teacher. The EFL teacher is at the very center of this situation. And we need to talk about the EFL teacher. We are all EFL teachers. You are EFL teachers. And I'm asking you to think about how you see yourselves First of all, are you a native speaker? Do you see yourselves as a fluent speaker? Is this your dream, to become a fluent, to be accurate, to be careful when you communicate? Or are you beginning to realize that essentially, because we are non-native speakers and teachers, we are non-native, there's no shame in being non-native. We have our own accent, for example, and we have our own way of interacting and perhaps making mistakes. But as EFL teachers, how important is it to be an efficient speaker? And how much is this part of what you do in your class? I realized that textbooks focus on fluency, accuracy, okay, not so much on efficiency, because efficiency means focusing on function. But so far, AFL textbooks focus on form primarily. Everything in EFL textbooks is perfect, okay? All language inputs, all listening inputs and reading inputs have no mistakes. Even those that supposedly created by non-native speakers. So my question to you is, do you see yourself as a custodian, as a gatekeeper of native speaker English? Do you see yourself as someone who is both an EFL teacher, but a non-native speaker as well? And do you see yourself as an ELF speaker who tries to be an efficient speaker? Okay, that's the question I would pose to you, because then you will see that excuse me, cut-through circles begin to show problems. We have the geographical orientation of the inner circle as being very specifically the UK, USA, and so on, geography. And then you have colonies and so on. Then you have the teaching context, where you have EFL contexts primarily. But if you look at communication, what is an inner circle communication? What is an outer circle communication? Who knows? In today's globalized world, there are no circles. There are no circles. We communicate openly and freely with anybody else. So in reality, the circles disappear. And what we have is enormous complexity. My question is, do you expose your learners to that complexity? Do you believe it's part of your job to make them aware of the fact that, well, English is very complicated? Because when we communicate in English, it's not simple at all. This is a hypercentral level 1 language, level 1 collective of dialects. It's complicated. Or do you expose your learners to a simple and simplistic way of looking at an EFL kind of way of inner circle, outer circle, some culture, a bit of intercultural communication, and we are fine, we are safe? Because it's not like that in real life. So I would ask you to also think about these questions. First of all, provide a description of your own teaching context, the geographical context. So I would imagine, as here in Europe, Mexico is an expanding circle context and an EFL context. But then the question is, what about the complexity? How much of this complexity informs your curriculum, the textbooks that you use, and the way you assess and test your students? This is the next question to ask. What is the context, in other words, in your case? And how much leeway do you have in opening up your situation towards this complexity, inviting complexity in your EFL context? This is where we're going. So now we're moving to our suggestion for EFL. We understand what EFL is, but we realize that ELF is a reality that cannot be um, disregarded. We need to acknowledge its existence. As we move on, especially for those of you who are in your 20s and early 30s as teachers of English, you have in front of you a career of teaching English for the next 30 years, 40 years. English is going to change. You cannot have an EFL, a limited and limiting concept of teaching English that will be the same today and tomorrow and in 20 years. You need to evolve. You need to change. And change is part of the discourse scientifically these days. Change. We need to find ways to change the way we teach. ELF awareness has been suggested as one way of integrating ELF in the EFL classroom. The key here to understand is that this is not simple. Why? Because EFL is something specific. We can define it, we can experience it. It's a foreign language. We have textbooks, we have dictionaries, we have testing methods, we have school advisors and supervisors and teachers. Everybody has an expectation. We know exactly what EFL is if you're a learner, if you're a learner's sponsor or a learner's parent. Everybody knows what EFL is. Equally, we have an understanding of what ELF is, but how can we, if we recognize the importance of incorporating ELF within EFL, how can we do it? ELF doesn't have dictionaries. ELF doesn't have textbooks. ELF doesn't have, if anything, ELF has rather negative attitudes as something that is below par, if you see what I mean. It's not native speaker. It's something that is there only because we are non-native speakers. And we wish it wasn't there. We wish we were native speakers. We wish our English was better. So what are the prerequisites to understanding ELF awareness? What is ELF awareness? First of all, we have to realize that ELF is not a language that can be taught. It's not a language. It's not the same with EFL. So what is it? If it's not a native language, it's not. What is it then? Does ELF have native speakers? What do you think? Does it have native speakers? ELF. We cannot think of ELF in the same way we think of EFL. It's different. We are all, well, it depends. It depends on how well you can accommodate, how efficient you are when you use English with other non-native speakers. So precisely because ELF is not a linguistic variety, we need more analyses of ELF discourse. And that's what everybody has been doing. Linguists, applied linguists, discourse analysts have been researching, collecting corpora of non-native speaker corpora, spoken corpora, written corpora, texts, countless texts of using English in non-native interactions. And they've been analyzing what is going on in these corpora. What are the pragmatic situations? What are the strategies used? We realize that ELF is real, but you cannot really touch it. You cannot contain it. It's intangible. It's fluid. That's the first thing. The second thing we realize is that ELF, and I like this really quite a lot because it speaks volumes, I think. ELF is not a think, but a way. It's not a thing, but a way. It's not something you can hold in your hands as you can, like a dictionary, but a way. It's a way of communicating. This adds further to its fluidity. But who is the ideal ELF speaker? Well, I would argue that in the same way that we cannot define the ideal native speaker, we cannot define the ideal ELF speaker. okay? It's very difficult because it's very fluid, it changes. Sometimes the efficient ELF speaker needs to make many mistakes. Otherwise, your interlocutor will not understand what you're saying. Sometimes the ELF speaker needs to use a very small group of words so that the other interlocutor will understand. And we're talking about adult interactions. So there's no such thing as an ideal ELF speaker. It would be very difficult to define it specifically. So the next question to ask, and we are, as you understand, we are always asking questions, always. We don't have the answers. We need input from you, what your input is, your reaction, your perceptions. We can make questions. So to what extent is communicative language teaching feasible, but without the native speaker? Because the communicative language teaching model as we know it developed in the 70s and 80s with the native speaker as a background model. We don't have that. So what is it? How can we teach with incorporating ELF? It's difficult. And the last thing we need to understand is that EFL learners are ELF users. That's really important. And we mentioned this before. EFL in the classroom, ELF outside the classroom. There's a mismatch between the two. So the aim is to bring the learner's ELF reality in the EFL classroom. That's what ELF awareness does. But there's a problem here. Attitudes can be really, really tricky because, and this is what research shows, learners and parents and perhaps even teachers may think that bringing ELF in the classroom is unworthy of the EFL formal teaching environment. It's inappropriate or even immoral. It's not your job. Your job is EFL. It's not ELF. So attitudes are really important. The easy answer here, if there's an answer, is if you want to integrate ELF, you should do it as much as your context allows, and only as much as that. There's no one single way of introducing ELF in your context. It depends on your context. If your learners are open, if this is not an exam-oriented situation, like preparing learners to sit a high-stakes exam, like Cambridge or Michigan, very native speaker-oriented exams, if this is not the case, you can incorporate ELF to an extent. So it's really up to you. It's really up to the teacher. So the EFL teacher makes a decision. But I'll give you the examples in a couple of minutes, in a few minutes. This slide points to this thing that I said, the distinction between EFL and what I call post-EFL, looking at English, which is not really a foreign language. And the fact that if you adopt an EFL approach, then your student's life is identical with the user's life. Students don't use English outside of the class. So it's like learning Chinese, only the classroom. So this is linear, it's one-dimensional, it's very easy. But if you accept that your learners have a life outside of EFL, then it's a two-dimensional. Complexity enters the situation. You begin to realize that they have a life, they have a say, they have opinions. And the question is, how much can your EFL context begin to look like a post-EFL context? It's not easy, of course. So, another discussion topic for you to make your notes. To what extent are your learners, are your students just learners of English or learners and users of English? And you can think of your own situation now. I'd like to think of your own situation. What is your context? Is it a typical EFL context where you keep away, you keep real usages of your learners using English outside of the classroom? Do you keep it away from your classroom, or do you invite it in your classroom? One more thing to remember, and this is really important, is that ELF doesn't really challenge EFL. ELF can never replace EFL. ELF will never replace EFL. If you accept this, then you would say, okay, well, we can incorporate ELF within EFL. We could do that. Because on the one hand, we cannot deny that ELF exists. We cannot deny that ELF is useful for EFL, but we don't know how to do it because, as we said, there's no textbooks or grammar books or dictionaries for ELF. So the question is, how? What pedagogy to use? I hope you realize this, that this is the big question. It becomes more and more, we realize this more and more. And teachers, this is what research shows, teachers realize the existence of ELF. But when you ask them, and this is the paradox here, you ask teachers, and we've been doing this for 20 years now, asking teachers what they think. And we have a paradox. On the one hand, they realize that ELF exists. They realize ELF is important. They realize that ELF is used by their learners, are ELF users. They realize that ELF is relevant for their own job. But when you ask them, would you integrate it in your EFL context? No, I wouldn't integrate it. That's the paradox. So there is an opening up, but we are scared. We don't know how to do it. But let me say what this slide shows is that, well, we don't want to replace or get rid of EFL. We can never do that. There's so much at stake, okay? No, all we can do is raise our learners' ELF awareness. But in order to do that, attitudes are really important. Learners should embrace it. They should understand that it's relevant. If they don't, it won't happen. Teachers should be autonomous. They should have some control in making decisions. This is not always the case. In Greece, for example, I know this happens in many contexts. There are contexts in which the teacher makes no decisions. None. The teacher is embedded sometimes in a particular EFL exam situation. This is your class, this is your curriculum, this is your textbook, now teach. Okay, so the teacher doesn't teach, the course book does the teaching, of course. The teacher corrects, assigns homework, and so on. So if teachers are not in some control, then we cannot incorporate ELF. We need that awareness. We should also at least integrate some activities, and this is my examples I will show you in a couple of minutes, that raise learners' confidence. That's another thing. There are EFL contexts in which learners feel that they are incompetent. They feel that they are not empowered to use English because English is treated as a foreign language, as something that is far away, the target. Being competent and being really, really a good English language user is very difficult. So there's no self-confidence. One way of raising their self-confidence is by introducing ELF awareness. Attitudes are very, very important. So in doing this, we need to develop a core curriculum for ELF. And this is where ELF pedagogy, ELF awareness comes in. What is ELF awareness? This is the definition we have suggested with my colleague Yasemin Bayurt from Boğaziçi University in Turkey. It's the process of engaging with ELF research and developing your own understanding as a teacher of the ways in which ELF can be integrated in your classroom context. So it's up to you. What you need to do is go through a continuous process of critical reflection. In other words, design ELF-aware lessons, experiment with them, try them, implement them with your class, and evaluate these lessons, these ideas. But this should be relevant to your own context, okay? Localization is really important. Now, there are three, ELF awareness has three parts. I'll go through this rather quickly because I want to go to the examples. The first part is awareness of language, awareness of ELF as a kind of discourse in terms of how do non-native users use English. They need to be aware of the discourse. So what's important here is exposing your learners to examples of ELF discourse and ask them to notice it, make them sensitive to it, alert them to it, so that they become aware of the existence of ELF as a reality, as something that exists. It's there. They become aware of it, and they become to realize that it's not bad. It's not. Yes, there may be deviations from a norm, but that's okay. What's bad is your preconceptions, your convictions that it's bad. But if you look at the context, it's erroneous. This discourse has errors for a reason. So you look at the complete context. Now, how do we incorporate ELF awareness in terms of making our learners aware of ELF discourse? How do we incorporate it in the classroom? By developing meta-linguistic activities. Meta-linguistic activities are activities that ask your learners to do exactly that. Look at why. Why are there mistakes? Yes, there are mistakes. But why? We've never asked this question, first and foremost. Secondly, I'll show you examples. For example, there are textbooks that are EFL textbooks and use inputs, listening inputs or reading inputs that are developed from non-native speakers. So you listen to a girl, say from Mexico, with an accent, with a Mexican accent, okay? But, so this is a non-native user using English. Everything is correct, everything's perfect. Intonation is perfect. The accent is no problem. Yes, there's an accent, but it doesn't mean, so this isn't ELF, this is not ELF. So you can develop meta-linguistic activities, not only with ELF discourse, but also with EFL discourse. You can ask your learners, look at this text. This text from your textbook is supposed to be written by a Mexican. Is it really written by a Mexican? Or is it written, it uses the notion of a Mexican to convince you that it's, there's a sense of cultural awareness. Cultural awareness needs to be, relevant, needs to be proved in terms of the language. So meta-linguistic activities are really important. Meta-linguistic activities are easy to develop. They focus attention of your learners on the language, on syntax, pronunciation, socio-cultural features, pragmatic features. And you make questions, you ask questions about that discourse. That's meta-linguistic, not linguistic, meta-linguistic. You ask why. Why does ELF communication works as it does? That's the number one. The second the second type of ELF awareness, because ELF awareness goes beyond that, is to ask, how do we teach English? How do we teach it? What do we do when we teach? What are our deeper convictions as teachers, and these convictions are shared by our learners, about what we expect, how we expect to teach. Do we correct all the time? How you know, what does the curriculum look like? Is it native speaker oriented, really? What does the textbook look like? What does it allow? What are, and this is important, what are our own personal theories as teachers about instruction, corrective feedback, and responding to learners' needs? Because as we know from research, and this is especially with the case with EFL teachers who don't go to seminars. These are colleagues who work a lot. They work a lot. They teach a lot, and they don't have the time to go to seminars. Training seminars, and they have developed their own theories, their own personal theories about teaching. That yes, I know that I should, but this is how I do it, and I've been doing it for 20 years, and nobody can persuade me otherwise. This is how I do it. I look at English in this way. So the self-perception of our role is really important, because it changes. We have to change with it. English is changing. Now, how can we incorporate this type of self-awareness in our teaching? By developing, we looked at meta-linguistic activities. Now we're looking at metacognitive activities. Metacognitive activities ask us and our learners to think why we have these thoughts, why we have these attitudes. Why do you believe that the native speaker is important? Why do you believe that you should always be correct? What is the underlying assumption there? That's metacognitive. Metacognitive means asking why about your own perceptions. Where do they come from? And thinking, reflecting critically about the origin of these perceptions. I'll show you examples. The last part of self-awareness is the impact of real-life usage of English on learning. Because the question here is, and this is really important, is, okay, we have EFL as a context, but what is the impact of our classes on our learners' learning? Do our learners learn English in our classes? What do they learn when we expose them, for example, to drills, to that type of activities, to comprehension checking questions? Do they really learn the language, or do they prepare themselves for the exam at the end, where no real learning takes place? So the question is, what is the impact of real life usage of English outside of the classroom on learning? Because we know, nobody can deny this, we know we learn from using. The more we use, that's when we learn, because you cannot learn a language only by learning the rules of the language. You need to be able to use it. And the more you use the language, the more you learn the language. So that's the question. In practice, how can we incorporate this self-awareness, this type of self-awareness, by incorporating in our EFL context authentic tasks with realistic communicational goals? By authentic, I mean tasks that are relevant to what our learners do outside of the classroom. Okay, not the traditional EFL activities. And I'll show you examples. We should ask our learners to reflect on their own convictions about English. Now, to do this, of course, we need to be in control. We need to know our teaching context. You'd be surprised how many teachers do not know the meaning of the term teaching context. What is teaching context? You know, who knows? So we have to be able to know. If you don't know where you teach and how you teach and why you teach the way that you teach, then you cannot really engage with self-awareness. Then you should know your learners. And the idea here is to make your lessons about themselves rather than about a specific target situation. It's about themselves, really. And of course, as we've said, know yourself. Also, we should welcome change. Everybody is talking these days, and for the past 10 years, everybody is talking about change. Not only in ELF research, in language research, in general. When we think of language these days, we think of the impact of that globalization is having on languages themselves, and how important English is in general as a language that impacts other languages. So we need to, what does it mean, welcome change? First of all, rethink correction and feedback. That's change. Change the way you correct. Change the way you think about feedback. Go beyond EFL, which looks at what learners should do, and use what learners already do with English. And realize that self-awareness is an opportunity for professional development. Nobody is asking you suddenly to embrace ELF. But the more you learn about ELF, the more you open up, and the more you learn about global English, the new situations, the more you develop professionally as a professional practitioner, teacher of English. You may decide not to incorporate ELF, but don't leave ELF outside of your professional interests, because, and you can quote me on that, that's the way we're going. English is going to change and is changing already. That's the way we're going. Okay, now let's go to the last part, and that's the part that everybody is waiting for, I imagine. Examples. I think we've said enough. Hopefully there are no problems with what we've said. You let me know in the comments. Examples from course books. Now, this is the hardest thing to do, because I'm going to make some suggestions of improving existing coursebook activities, and make these activities from EFL coursebooks, make them more self-aware. Now, the problem with textbooks, EFL textbooks are great, but they tend to have some issues. One of these issues is that they tend to use topics that on the surface are culturally sensitive, but in reality, they do not fully exploit these things. They talk about culture and they talk about interculturality in a very general and perhaps stereotypical way. Secondly, they tend to incorporate tasks that are traditionally influenced by high-stakes testing, like using comprehension checking, ABCD, choose the correct answer, or make tick here, tick there. These are not authentic tasks. They are exam tasks, very easy to mark with correct answers and incorrect answers that give marks. That's what they tend to do. And of course, they do not favor reflective and metalinguistic and metacognitive questions. So textbooks are ideal for what we're doing right here. Let's try to see how we can incorporate these notions. And let's start from how textbooks define and look at culture. There is a large cultural approach. What is culture? You know, I'm Greek, you're Spanish, you're Mexican, you're American. Very stereotypical. What does it mean to be Greek? What does it mean to be Mexican? Large culture. Okay. Well, that's more EFL. It's not ELF. ELF is a small cultural approach. In other words, you focus on the individual as much as possible. So you try to focus on a particular person, a particular role in a textbook. And you try to describe that role as much as possible, not in terms of stereotypes, but in terms of everything that everything that this role has experienced in their lives. I mean, for example, examples of large cultural approaches of textbooks is names of certain characters in textbooks. I cannot begin to count the number of times I've seen the word Juan as a Spanish person. Juan is always a typical Spanish name. Why would it does have to be Juan? Okay, you know, make it different, make it small culture, small. But this is difficult for EFL because EFL is simplistic. Okay, let's move on. I believe that ELF awareness is ideal for small cultures, for exactly this approach. And I'll show you an example from this textbook. Now, this is a textbook that was developed in 2008 from the Greek state. It was designed by Greek teachers of English. It went through a rigorous process of evaluation, and it is still used today. This is the second grade of junior high school, the advanced learners. So this is B2, B1, B2 level, 13-year-olds. Okay, well, look at this activity. Immediately you see the picture. Okay, this is what? Large culture, large. You have one black, one Chinese, Japanese, one blonde girl. This is not reality. But textbooks are like that. Now, if you look at number 1.1, the task says these children come from different places. Where do you think they come from? Just by looking at them. Well, this activity invites students to think stereotypically. If you're blonde, well, you must be coming from the north of Europe. I don't know. If you are black, you must be coming from Africa. That's ridiculous. Today, these activities, large culture. The second activity, what do you have in common with these children? Do you have any differences? That's an example of a small culture because you identify individuals. And this is a good example because you invite your learners to think about themselves. Let's move on. So you see, this is like a background, okay, to what this textbook looks like. Look at this. This is the second page of this unit. Now, I think one of the reactions people may have here is that because this is not a very advanced proficiency level, we should not talk about complicated matters. That's a fallacy. Of course you can. Even younger learners, adolescents, have experiences. They can, but of course, they may not be able to express all these ideas in English. They need translanguaging. They need to talk about them in their own language. That's okay. ELF awareness invites that. So these are the questions. Where do the boys in each picture live? You can see, again, large culture. What are they wearing? What is the weather like? These are the questions. And the expected answers, I'm sure that the expected answers refer to a grammatical point in this unit that okay, describing people. Now, we said in alpha awareness, it's the one idea is to develop metacognitive activities. So this is an example that I'm suggesting of making this restrictive, very poor activity, making it alpha aware. You can add these questions and start engaging your learners. Well, the first question, all of these questions actually, treat these simplistic figures as real people. And all it does is invite your learners to think about themselves with reference to these people as an opportunity. So this is an opportunity. This is something to start from. So one question says, what kind of English would these characters use to communicate with you? Well, that's a metacognitive activity. What kind of English? Native speaker English, or not native speaker English, or some other kind of English. So you see, we are beginning to enter these characters' lives rather than looking at them from a distance. Where do they live? What are they wearing? What kind of English would they use? That's a different question, because you have to think about it. How do you think about it? By relating it to your own experience. I am like them. I live in a country where English is not the main language. So I am like them. The second question, do you think it would be British or American English? These are very simple questions that raise awareness. Do you think you may have a problem understanding them? This is a question that makes learners think about accommodation. I may have a problem understanding them if they don't, for example, their accent may be different, okay, or they may speak slowly or fast, or they may use the prosody would be different. So you see, you're using what you have in this textbook to raise awareness through the use of very simple questions. The last question, what would you or they do in order to be understood? There you have it, accommodation. You can go further. In what ways would the English used by Nuru and Tiki help them understand and appreciate their cultural differences? And I'm sure that your learners would have a lot to say about that. That English is a global language, and we can use it to share our differences. We can talk about, different pronunciation, different accents, different ways of using grammar, influenced by the L1. So Greek L1 would form a different ELF than Nuru's L1. I don't know what Nuru's L1 is, but I imagine it would be different than my English. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. And the last bullet, in what ways would it help them connect and identify their cultural similarities? So how can we be different when we use English? How can we be similar? We're still using English. We connect. So this is an example of raising alpha awareness by introducing metacognitive activities in a textbook that is very traditionally EFL. This is another example. Now, I realize we don't have a lot of time, and I want to go to the Q&A, but let me show you this example. So this is a student reporter interviewing an anthropologist about the way people look. Now, if you look at this text, it's very traditional, that the way people look defines who they are and if their facial characteristics are different, very stereotypical. It goes on. And I want to focus on how we can redress the balance here. Okay. Now, the tasks, as you can see, are traditional tasks. But you can add these types of questions, metacognitive questions, using what you have. For example, you can ask, you can say that these physical characteristics, this environment represents an old-fashioned, entrenched way of seeing the world. But is it really like that anymore? It's, your learners know it's not like that anymore. Why not criticize the input when you know it's old-fashioned and doesn't respond to reality? When you have a textbook that has this kind of information, why not challenge it? Why not invite your learners to challenge it and be critical about it, be reflective about it? So what you can do, since this is an anthropologist, what you can do, or an ethnographer, you can ask your learners to be ethnographers of their own world. And that would be an activity. And this is what it would look like. You can ask them, starting from what they do in real life, in their own real life. So what they do you enjoy playing video games? Do you chat with other players? Okay, in general. Then you move on to linguistics, to language communication. What do you chat about? How often do you talk about stuff other than the video game? What is this stuff about? Wonderful. Your learners would really enjoy these questions. And now you can talk about the language. What language do you use when you chat? Why do you use that language? Do you use English? What do you do in order to understand and be understood by the other players? How would you describe, this is the ELF, the English that you use when you chat, Skype with fellow players? You see what I mean? These are metacognitive questions that do not challenge the EFL situation. They add to it. And it's up to you to make them relevant. As you can see, these tasks do not replace EFL. Okay, they add to it. We leave EFL tasks do the job of teaching English. If you have to use the EFL textbook, you have to use it. You cannot throw it away. You don't want to throw it away. There are many EFL textbooks that are great, but EFL textbooks have a very specific orientation that we can never go away from. Well, why not add to them? And this is what I've suggested. So, in conclusion, ELF awareness, small cultures, cross-cultural and intercultural competence and communication. That's what we want. We want to add reflective questions. That's the idea of raising, that's how you can raise ELF awareness. Even when your textbook doesn't do it, you can add just one question. Nobody's asking you to spend an hour. You can spend an hour if you can, if you want, but nobody's really talking about that. It's up to you to decide to what extent, because these are the questions that will be more and more relevant. And I believe that your learners will thank you for that, because, and they will realize, precisely because they refer to attitudes, becoming aware, they would realize that they will begin to see English in a much different way, and they will become empowered as they do that. Transformation today is at the core of ELF awareness. We want to make our learners empowered and self-confident. And I believe the way to do it is by raising metalinguistic questions, by developing metalinguistic and metacognitive questions, and making our learners ELF aware and ourselves ELF aware. And by doing that, we become better teachers. I want to thank you for this opportunity. You can use this email to send me any questions you have, any comments, and I'm now open to discussion. Let's go to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikos. It was really enlightening. I think that many of us have used maybe some strategies to promote health awareness, but we haven't done it, I mean, with that intentionally. We haven't done it just like that, right? So
Exactly.
this was really great. So now I open for questions and answers. I don't know, Nikos, if you could stop sharing the screen so I can see all of them and see if they have questions. It was a real pleasure to hear you, really, because it was, wow.
It's my pleasure. Let me try and, how do I do that?
I can help you, I think.
Can you please help me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Super. Thank you.
Okay, now, if you have any question, we have like 15 minutes, I think, because I wouldn't like to take more time from you. We have some minutes to, if you have questions. So, Cristian, ¿me podrías ayudar para que ellos ya puedan quitar su micrófono? If somebody has a question, please raise your hand.
Ya está listo.
Muchas gracias, Cristian. I think I don't see all of you. If you want to make a question, just start speaking and then. Okay, no questions. That seems that we are just starting to think about all the things, they are going to start landing.
I can see the chat. I'm going through the chat.
There are lots of opinions there, which are very interesting.
I'm really impressed with what I'm reading. I believe that everybody here is very mature and ready to go to the next level, I believe. And there is a realization of the importance of incorporating ELF. And I'm really glad to see that. Thank you for the positive reaction, really. Let me see if I can find a question somewhere here.
Yeah, for example, Adrian Soler from Orizaba says lots of insights to reflect on and our daily practice and redo several things in our classes. Adela, would you want to make a question or could you turn off your mic?
There is a question from Gloria. Many teachers, she says, many teachers may not be certain how to do it, how to incorporate ELF awareness, because it may imply time-consuming, for example, or because it is not explicitly stated in the content of a syllabus. That's true. That's really true. I'm thinking that in my context, for example, in the state school, very few teachers know the syllabus. They don't have access to it. They're not interested in learning what the syllabus is. What they know is the textbook, especially in the state. So they have a textbook that is handed out to them. This is the textbook you're going to be using. And the textbook essentially is the syllabus for them. So they go through the textbook. What they do in many cases is add, some of the teachers want to be more creative, so they would go online and search on YouTube, for example, on the internet, and find additional materials to incorporate in addition to the textbook. And this is laudable. This is excellent. Many teachers do this, especially now when lessons take place online. So the textbook is one source of information. They have additional links to YouTube videos and so on. It would be great if during these online meetings, it would be, and if you could do it too, to add some more reflective questions and try to make your learners, take this opportunity to make your learners more aware of global English and the fact that global English is there. Global English is part of reality. Your learners may not be aware of that. They may believe that they know they use English, but their awareness of English would be that whatever takes place outside of the classroom is bad English, and we should not talk about it. This is not we should not acknowledge it. It's a bad thing. And this context, this lesson, the EFL lesson, is good English. So please teach me, give me more good English. It would be great if they can, if through these questions, these meta-linguistic questions and metacognitive questions, they can become more aware of reality, especially if they are younger, if they're adolescents, and if they are young adults in their 20s, because it's all about being confident when we use English. If you're not confident, you cannot begin to use accommodation strategies. You have to be confident to deviate from the norm and be creative with the language. This is one of the issues. I believe that ELF corpora should include more and more input from speakers, ELF users who are not very advanced. And they are not very confident. They are more restricted. We need more data because the world, there are millions and hundreds of millions of people who use English who are not confident. A great place to find this information is YouTube. And but it's difficult to search because you cannot search, you cannot write on YouTube non-native English and find, you will get different solutions. I think the best way to do it, what you're looking for essentially in your context would be ask your own learners their favorite YouTubers and ask them if they have YouTubers who are not American, not native speakers, but they are from Mexico, from Latin America, but use English, and ask them to bring you these examples. Ask them. I'm sure they will get, you will be surprised with the results. Your learners know ELF. They just haven't realized itself. They go to the YouTube videos for the content, but now you can focus their attention on the language and the strategies. What a great opportunity, what a great way to raise ELF awareness through these. And your learners would be very glad to do it, I believe.
Thank you, Nikos. Arturo Almeida says, my only question, and I think it's very tough, is how can we challenge the scheduled times of institutions in a way that both parts are satisfied? Students, school, and teachers, I would add.
That's a very good question and very difficult to address. It's very difficult. I would say what I said before. It's not about challenging. It's not about, we're not, this is not a war. We're not in a war. We want to just add another dimension. That dimension can be very small, very minute, or it can be more extensive. It's up to you. I don't know your context, but I would urge you to just ask questions. Just ask your students. Start to have a relationship with your students that is beyond, outside the box. Ask them about English. Ask them what they do with English. And this would be the beginning. This could be a start. Progressively, you can add more questions in the same in the light of the ones I'm using, and you can make them more reflective. Think more about that. That's why I believe, well, we're talking about now younger students, but there are many adult learners, adults, who come to us to learn English for specific purposes. English for specific purposes. And I mean, you know, ESP. ESP is a huge domain, and you have different needs and different learners. For example, you may have an adult a businessman who comes to you to prepare him for a presentation that he has to give in China. Okay, that's the job. That's the job. This is a very typical ESP situation. I don't know if you're familiar with that type of teaching English. Now, what they would ask you as a teacher is train me in how to make the presentation as a native speaker. But your learner would not be a native speaker, and the Chinese audience would not be native speakers. So you can begin to explain to them and train them, make them aware of the reality that, look, this is not about native speaker. This is about communicating effectively and efficiently. So you can use your own accent, you can make mistakes, you can accommodate, and there are many more and more contexts, teaching contexts like that. Adults with a specific target. I'm not talking about getting a certificate of proficiency. That's a different thing. I'm talking about a very specific need, making a presentation. There was another example of the wife of an ambassador. Okay, now this lady needed English. She was the wife of an ambassador, and you know, the ambassador came to the country, and she wanted lessons in order to be able to use English at dinner parties. Dinner parties. That's what the wife of an ambassador does, apparently. That's not EFL at all. That's, you know, the ambassador of I don't know, Mexico in Greece. Everybody's a non-native speaker. So why think of native? Why think of I have to use English properly? No, you don't. You need to use English effectively with Greeks and with Mexicans, if you're a Greek. So the needs of learners are not always the needs we believe they are. They are different. So when you have a situation where a learner comes to you with a specific you know, they ask you to teach them, ask yourselves, is this a native speaker situation? Is it an exam situation? Or is it something else? If it's not an exam, you have a wonderful opportunity to make them self-aware. It's part of your job, I believe, to make them self-aware.
We have another question. I don't know if you can read it, Vero.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nikos, for your very interesting presentation. In the chat, I wrote that if you think that it is possible that a learner who moves abroad and studies in a BA, for example, in the US or Canada, would he or she be able to survive or succeed in an academic environment using English as a lingua franca, or they need to be like to have like the EFL as we usually ask in standardized or certification exams? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I believe that EFL will never leave. It depends on the target situation. So if your learner wants to go to an inner circle context, And by inner circle, I mean the USA is an inner circle. Canada is inner circle. Then, especially a university context, a BA context, if I understand correctly, then another thing you have to ask is, okay, well, this is a non-native speaker. The English they would use when they speak would be ELF. However, if this is a university context, there's a lot of writing. There's assignments. This is writing, academic English, in other words. With academic English, nobody is a native speaker. You move away from the concept of native speaker. In fact, native speakers are more problematic in writing good academic papers than non-native speakers, because non-native speakers have learned the language properly. The native speakers think they know the language, and when they write, especially the early assignments that they write, they tend to use informal registers and things that are not academic at all. So as far as academia is concerned, writing academic English, everybody needs to acquire the rules of academic writing. But in terms of spoken English, it's a different thing. Again, with spoken English, what kind of spoken English are we talking about? Are we talking about making presentations, academic presentations? If you're making academic presentations, as I'm doing right now, you have to use academic discourse. You have to use the proper expected genre, in other words. But if you're using English in a bar or in a friendly situation, if you want to go to your advisor's office and ask them questions, you don't need to be academic. You can use ELF. In fact, you need to use ELF, especially if your advisor is not a native speaker. See what I mean? So it's not as straightforward. We have to look at exactly what we're talking about. Is it written speech, oral speech? What genre are we talking about? But it's a good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Really, I think we have finished with this. Thank you so much. This was really great. Great. You can see all the chats. Thank you. This was enlightening. This was probing.
Yes.
Thank you very much, really. And before you leave, before all the other teachers leave, I would invite you to our next webinar, which is next Friday, and it's Understanding the Dimensions of Learning-Oriented Assessment with James Purpura from the Columbia University. I would send you in the afternoon the invitation to the coordinators so you can receive them. As you can see, Nikos, really, I think it's your first time you are working in Mexico.
Yes.
So really, I think that we need to be in contact and to have you again as soon as possible.
Adriana, it's been my great pleasure and honor to be part of this. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to hearing from everybody. Let me know what you're doing in your own endeavors to make yourself and your learners ELF-aware. It's a process that will never end. It's an ongoing process. Thank you very much. And I look forward to visiting and getting to know everybody closer from another, not this Zoom. I don't like Zoom very much.
Well, that's what we've got. And really it has resulted in being very useful, I think. At least we have you.
Of course. Well, we're teachers and we want to connect closely. We need to be together. But this is we have to do this online, of course, for the foreseeable future, at least.
Of course. I hope we can have you in the near future in person here.
at the University of Veracruz. Thank you so much, Nikos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all the teachers really from the Self-Access Centers, from the Language Center, from the Language School. Thank you for being here, and I hope you accompany me next Friday with Jim Purpura. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.